The Seeking Justice podcast crew acknowledge the First Nations peoples of Australia, specifically the Yagara and Turrbal peoples of Meanjin and Brisbane, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live and work. We acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to their ancestors, their descendants, their elders past, present and emerging who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We also acknowledge the need for all of us to reclaim our own indigeneities from the lands from whence we came. Welcome everyone to the Seeking Justice podcast. This is episode 6 and I am joined by a fabulous guest, Corinne Fagueret, who has spent the last 25 years fighting for social, environmental and climate justice. She was born in Paris to a French father and immigrated to Sydney when she was 15 with her Jewish-Polish mother, joining the rest of her maternal family who had escaped the Holocaust and migrated to Australia after the Second World War. Over the years, Corinne has led diverse grassroots campaigns. These have included Stand Up for Nature campaign against New South Wales land clearing reforms in 2016, the Better Planning Network campaign on planning and development in New South Wales from 2012 to 2014, and most recently, in fact, last week, the grassroots-led initiative that led to more than 500 Jewish Australians signing a full-page advertisement in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age against President Donald Trump's ethnic cleansing plan, the Riviera of the Middle East for Gaza, of course, that everyone would have seen the announcement off the cuff as it comes from the Oval Office with Benjamin Netanyahu. Corinne has also worked extensively in partnership with the Pacific, particularly the small island nations of Kiribati and Tuvalu, to help enhance the voices of Pacific Islanders on the importance of climate justice. She brings 25 years' experience, as I said, in environmental social justice advocacy, policy program development across government and NGO sectors, and she has got quite a remarkable legacy if you have a look on her LinkedIn profile, including being involved in many different campaigns, and I was particularly interested in also the work in developing the New South Wales Aboriginal Languages Policy in 2002, securing $1.2 million for a New South Wales Aboriginal Languages Centre in the same year, and also developing and implementing the New South Wales Aboriginal Youth Leadership Pilot Project in 2007. A vast array of qualifications, including a Masters of Environmental Studies at Macquarie University, Bachelor of Arts, First Class Honours in French at UNSW, and a lot of awards, including, interestingly and maybe even ironically, the News Corp Pride of Australia 2014 medal in the New South Wales Environment category. So that's wonderful. Thank you, Corinne. Lovely to have you on the podcast. How are you going?
Thank you, Benedict, and thank you for that comprehensive introduction. I think the most comprehensive introduction I've ever had. Thank you so much.
Not at all. And thank you for coming on at relatively short notice. Obviously, it's been quite an amazing week with your latest project, which is the more than 500 Jewish Australians against ethnic cleansing, the advertisement, which we'll put up. That was in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald last week. And I was interested to know, where the idea came from and how it all came together.
Well, the idea came from a very similar ad that was published in the New York Times on the 13th of February this year and was signed by 350 rabbis, Jewish creatives, and other high-profile Jewish Americans. And that said very similar things to our ad. The ad was speaking out against Trump's plan for Gaza, and it had a clear statement that Jewish people in America say no to ethnic cleansing. I saw that ad circulating on Facebook, and I actually posted it on an informal group that I'm part of and have been part of since October 2023. So it's a group called Australian Jewish Women for Peace Action Group. And posted the ad there. And the reaction from the group was very instant and very definite. We must do the same here in Australia. And so we got a small organizing committee together, and we started to recruit, number one, signatories, and number two, funding. We crowdfunded the ad from donations of individuals. No particular group funded this ad. It was really funded through Jewish Australians who donated.
Yes.
And we alerted our networks, Jewish Australian networks, and very, very rapidly, in a matter of days, we had 500 signatories, and more were actually contacting us, but we couldn't fit them onto the page, onto the ad. So that's
Amazing.
how it happened, really. It was a truly grassroots, community-led initiative to give voice to the huge amount of concerns and level of concern within the Jewish community about Trump's proposal.
Yes. And I can see, I've got the ad here in front of me, and as I said, we'll put it up, but there's some quite prestigious names on there. I can see a few barristers on there, a number of doctors, professors, actually lots of doctors, professors. And so it was really just about getting word of mouth through the networks that it came together.
Absolutely. So we did not actively contact any one person on that list.
Wow.
It was literally word of mouth through networks. There was a hunger for people to put their name on this ad. And every single name that you see on the ad contacted us.
That's amazing. And I can actually see one of my friends who's an artist, an eco-artist, actually, Aviva Reed there. It's really incredible. Out of curiosity, how much does a one-page ad in the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald cost?
We got, so for a Tuesday, Wednesday publication,
Yes.
we got a deal for $11,000.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So that was,
For both days or
Both.
just?
So that was for publication either on Tuesday or Wednesday.
Okay. Yep.
And for publication of a full page in the Age and in the Sydney Morning Herald. So it was a combined price. But of course, if you've ever had to deal with advertising, these prices constantly change depending on the demand, depending on the day that you publish on, and the readership numbers on that particular day. So that we were able to fundraise that.
Yes.
And it was a blessing, really, to get it in, so quickly.
Well,
Because,
so quickly.
12 days after the New York ad
Yes.
was published, we had ours in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age. And I've seen now that the Italian Jewish community has done the same ad in Italy.
Amazing.
As well.
Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah, it's like the Grassroots on Boost, the boosted Grassroots. What a wonderful initiative. And it sounds like if you had more people contacting you, you could almost do a wraparound front page next time, maybe.
We're thinking about it.
Thinking about it. That's excellent. And Corinne, what was the impact or effect of it? Is it still, resonating?
I think it was a very important initiative, both within the Jewish community, but also for social cohesion
Yes.
in Australia. So within the Jewish community, people haven't felt represented necessarily by our mainstream organizations.
Yes.
And there are a lot of opinions that are not necessarily spoken for various reasons.
Yep.
Personal reasons, family reasons, community reasons. And I think that it was very important for the signatories, and certainly for myself as a signatory, to say, I'm not okay with what's happening. I'm not okay with what's happening, and I want my voice to be heard. It was very important for me as a signatory to be able to say, this is what is happening is not okay with me, and
Yes.
I have a voice. And so within the Jewish community, it was a very important initiative. But I think it was also an important initiative in terms of social cohesion. And we had a number of Palestinian Australians contact us and say, thank you for standing in solidarity with us. So hopefully, the Palestinian community in Australia can see plainly that there are many Jews who see what's happening and do not think that this is an acceptable outcome at all for Palestinian people. So for both reasons, I think that there was a lot of pride amongst the signatories to the ad. And it was an important initiative, and I hope that it will lead to other initiatives as well.
Absolutely. I think that on so many different levels, I think it makes a difference. And just going out through the grapevine effect, people might not have read it, but it goes out to, through the multicultural veins of our society and, creates health in that because, as you said, it creates social cohesion. Just before we started recording, I was telling you, in just absolute frustration, I had gone and set up my chambers outside Parliament House in February last year and called it Ceasefire Chambers. And my media consultant, he put out a media release and didn't get any media attention. And it was a busy news day, but I don't think it would have. But that wasn't my purpose. My purpose was posting it on LinkedIn to give people more broadly, and certainly Palestinian Australians, but people more broadly, I guess that feeling of you're not alone. There's people care about what's happening. And it's actually got a bit of a legacy in my family because my mother, and this little story did inspire me because she got me writing letters for Amnesty International when I was, 15 or 16. And she, she's never been overtly activist or political. She was the CEO of a private hospital at the time. But when the genocide was occurring in East Timor, she was sitting at home. I think she'd had the day off work with a cold or a flu. It was pouring with rain, and she was watching it on television. She was like, "That's it, I've had enough." And so she wrote up a little sign, and she went in the pouring rain and stood outside the Indonesian embassy and just blocked the cars coming in and out, And so it felt like that. It was just like a solitary action. I didn't try and get other people to come down or whatever. I just wanted to. It was almost for my conscience, but also to let people know, and also just to be a bit brave. If we all be a bit brave and take a risk and put ourselves out there, that's also important in these times.
Absolutely. It's crucial, actually. And what has been with me since October 23, and since Israel invaded Gaza and with all the, the atrocities that took place as a result of that invasion and the genocide that is taking place, is that I've remembered the Holocaust, and all my life I've had this question about, how could the Holocaust happen? I visited the Treblinka death camp a few years ago, where my extended family on my maternal side ended up murdered there. And I stood there and I thought, how could this happen? How could the world let this happen? And I have answered that question in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
I finally have my answer.
Yeah.
It's because the world did nothing.
Yes.
And people did nothing. And for me, that's a terrifying thought, that I could be the one doing nothing.
Yes.
So I really agree with you. I think that it's very, very important, even if you're one person, to do what your conscience tells you to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in my history degree before I did law, I studied the French resistance to Nazi occupation. And even when I was at high school, the religious education teacher brought some nuns in from Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide. And at the end, I was so moved, I just went down to volunteer if I could, because I wanted to escape school. But I was just like, people need to do something, I can't believe it. And I'd always thought, well, it's just normal that you just drop everything and try and stop a genocide or atrocities or whatever. But obviously we've all come to realize that a lot of people just don't pay any attention or get on with life or don't acknowledge it or, whatever it might be. But when I was 17 and I went to Europe, or I went to London to escape my reality with my, family situation and finish high school, and going on a bit of an adventure and finding oneself as a late teenager. But I went to Dachau concentration camp, and that was, even now I get shivers down my spine because it was so, it was just incredibly haunting. But I'll never forget the pictures, the photographs they had on the walls of the local residents coming in after this had been going on, and had, whether they were feigning ignorance or whether they just not bothered to process, or whether they couldn't, but certainly the sentiment was this shock on their faces, and that they couldn't believe that this had been happening in their neighbourhood, kind of thing. But it was, and you could see the horror on their faces that this had been going on, right under their noses, in the sense that there was quotations of them talking about the smells from this concentration camp. And yeah, I'll never forget that. It's very hard to comprehend the human brain in how it operates in these ways, because that's where all of this comes from, as far as I'm concerned. The ways that our brains operate and the way that we process information or don't, the way that we get amygdalated, the way that, and obviously there are good reasons for that happening, but sometimes it's, fear, politics, and and we can't forget intergenerational trauma in so many different contexts in the world, and certainly in Australia, but certainly in the Jewish community, of course. So can you talk to me a little bit more about your family and their experiences immigrating to Australia, and your experiences, in the Jewish community growing up in Australia? I'm particularly interested because you've got this amazing record of all of this brilliant social justice and eco-justice work you've done and you've obviously very devoted to, you've been very effective at. Who and what inspired you to do that and follow that path in the context of your upbringing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say that both sides of my family were communists.
Yes.
So my grandparents on the French side were communists. They were in the French communist resistance. And on my mother's side, as many Jews from Eastern Europe were, because it was looked at as an opportunity for equality and justice. So, my grandparents, my Polish grandparents, were also communists. That meant that I grew up in a household that had values around justice and human rights and equality, and so it was in my background. This being said, I think the other factor was that I had a violent father, and he was violent towards me, especially. And that's why, one of the big reasons why we left France. And so I had a very strong experience of what injustice felt like at home and what powerlessness felt like. Not being able to do anything to rectify the injustice that you are enduring. And I think that stayed with me until today. The way that I deal with injustice and I react to injustice is by taking action. There is something in me that is pushing me to take action. And I think that it's partly due to that experience of powerlessness and fear and violence in my childhood. That's how I understand it. So when I was 15, my mother, who was Polish and married a Frenchman, decided that, it would be better for us to immigrate to Australia and go and live near her parents who had immigrated to Australia after the war.
Yep.
And so we did. So I arrived here and I was very lost culturally, because French culture is very different from Australian culture. And we migrated from Paris to Maroubra, so in Sydney. I don't know if you know Maroubra, but
I do. Yeah.
And this is Maroubra in the 1980s, not Maroubra now.
Yeah.
So it was a little
bit more laid back than Paris, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it was very different culturally.
Less refined, I would suspect.
Well, I don't feel, Australia is much more refined than France in some ways, so I don't know if that term is the right term, but it was very different, that's for sure.
Was Maroubra very multicultural back then?
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
No. And it was a bit rough, with the Bra
boys. Yeah.
Yeah. It had an element of roughness to it. And I found it very difficult. I found it the first 6 months I was crying every morning before school, and my mum used to bring me to Maroubra Beach, and we used to, do some breathing, and it's difficult. It's a very difficult age to migrate at, regardless.
Had you learnt, so were you trilingual?
No, bilingual. So I had learned English, and we had a brief stint in Australia when I was 6 years old because of the same reason.
Oh, okay.
Because of my father. So,
so you'd moved at 15, so you were like right in the middle of teenagehood as well, which is even difficult anyway. Yeah.
Yes. And so my mum had the idea that, perhaps I would have something in common with the Jewish youth group.
Yes.
And so she sent, we tried, and I started going to a Zionist youth movement called Netzer.
Yep.
And I went to Netzer, and I did. It really helped me, because
Right.
suddenly we were talking about politics, and we
Mm.
were talking about culture, and there was something that I could relate to. And, I spent some years in the movement.
Yep.
I ended up going on a program called Machon, which
Yep.
is a Zionist program designed to, introduce Israel to Jews in the diaspora in the hope that they might migrate there one day.
Yep.
And in Israel, I had some experiences that made me question the whole thing.
Yes. Can you
That
go into that at all?
raised a lot of questions for me.
Can you go into that at all? Those
Yeah. First of
experiences?
all, I had my first love was an Israeli soldier,
Yes.
and he was in
And
the middle of his.
and how old were you? Sorry.
I
When
was
you were.
18, and
Yes.
he was a little bit older, 19, I think, 19 and a half, and he was in the middle of his army service. And some weekends he would come back, and we would spend the weekend together, and he would tell me about his experience in the West Bank. He was stationed at some of the checkpoints in the West Bank, and he would tell me, and he would cry. And he would
Wow.
say that he hated it, and he hated what was happening, and he hated how the army treated the Palestinians, and he hated the whole thing, and he wanted to do nothing, to have nothing to do with it. And he actually left Israel. He ended
Wow.
up leaving Israel. He's now living in London.
Yep.
And that was shocking to me because I had no knowledge, of what was happening. And they were also teaching us the Zionist version of history, which is very focused on the Arab countries attacked us on the Independence Day, and the Palestinians ran away
Yep.
from inside Israel, and so
Mm.
that's the version that we were taught, and I'm not negating that some people may have run away because they were
Yep.
scared, but I don't think it's the full version of the story, and
Yep.
I at the age of 18, I started asking questions, and I couldn't get the answers to satisfy me.
Mm. Yep.
But I loved Israel, and I loved, the culture there, the people. I had a lot of family there. I have a lot of family there. So it was a very fraught year for me.
Yeah.
It was a very fraught year.
And so the program, you go and live in Israel and you work there presumably, or
Yeah,
it's
so you
just
have
about
6
a
months.
cultural experience.
Yeah, 6 months of a cultural experience in Jerusalem, and then you do then you do a stint in one kibbutz, and then another stint in another kibbutz.
Yep.
And I did the first stint in the kibbutz, and then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
Oh, wow.
And he was threatening to send chemical weapons onto Israel, and my mother could not cope, and she asked me to leave, and I did.
Yes.
So, in effect, that cut my years short. A lot of people did end up leaving because their parents were terribly worried, as you can imagine.
Mm.
And I came back to Australia. And I, continued to ask questions.
Yeah.
And to feel uncomfortable with what I felt was only part of the story.
Yes.
Of what had happened in the land of Israel, Palestine.
Mm. How was the kibbutz experience? The kibbutz.
I personally hated it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I hated it. It was very, very hard work.
Yes.
I worked in the banana plantations in Kibbutz En Gev near the Galilee Lake, Tiberias. And we would wait. It was very hot, very dusty work. We would get up at 4 a.m. every day.
Wow.
And it was incredibly hard work.
Yeah.
Um,
Especially lifting, like harvesting the bananas? So they're quite heavy.
Harvest, and cutting leaves, and there
Yeah.
were bees, and it was
Yeah.
just very, very hard, dusty, hot work. On top of that, the kibbutzim, they're not what they were already not what they used to be, at
Yes.
the creation of Israel. It already was deteriorating, in terms of the ideology that really motivated the creation of kibbutzim
Yes.
in Israel.
Which I'd understood. I had well, this is in my pre-law days, but I'd done some I think it was like olive picking down in Margaret River. I'm apart from Perth, and there was an Israeli lady who was doing it with us, and she told us a lot about the kibbutzim, and I was really attracted to the idea of what she was telling us, because it sounded to me kind of like what you would say is a hippie community here, or an eco community, in terms of, growing food, feeding the community, living in community, that kind of thing. And so I was really interested. I'd also traveled with some Israelis in South America many years ago, and they had stories from coming actually out of the Air Force, but talking about how they'd served their time, but then they felt that they were enticed to then stay longer, basically because of Top Gun, Tom Cruise, leather jacket, cool sunglasses, and then, I mean, maybe it's just a boys or a male thing, but, I guess, it was interesting traveling with them and hearing their stories. Mm.
Yeah, I think the kibbutzim started, on a very ideological, basis, for equality and, looking after each other and a sense of community and all those things. But I think that a lot of it has changed now, and it had already changed when I was there.
Is that in terms of the governance or the...
Look, I'm not an expert in, the movement of kibbutzim, but I think economically, a lot of them, were unable to function.
Yes.
When they started, people were sharing clothes. It was hard. It was a hard life in Israel at the beginning, and you really had to be ideologically committed, to stay there.
Yes.
And to make a go of it. So people that lived there, a lot of them were very idealistic.
Yes.
A lot of them came from the Holocaust. They wanted equality and a different way of life, and it was very hopeful. And when I see now what's happening, it's heartbreaking for me and many other Jews.
I was watching there's so much content obviously about this, but I was watching a video, and I posted this, but it's a Palestinian American, and somehow he just goes into chat rooms and he talks with Israelis because he's interested in bridging the divide and having a conversation. And I think he'd done a number of these videos, and then he released a kind of mashup of him doing, talking to 100 different Israelis, but a lot of these were like teenage girls, boys, and the stuff that they were saying was just mind-boggling in terms of just very pro-genocidal and kind of laughing about it. Obviously kids that age don't probably know the the impact of it all. One wonders how much news that they, with the military censor and everything else, that they get exposed to anyway. But the thing that really struck me, and this, and just from an objective perspective, but the color of the skin of a lot of the Israelis was darker than the guy who was the Palestinian, and I guess certainly from my perspective, white Australian. Obviously there's an ethnic, racial aspect to this whole conflict, but then just in terms of the color, I was really surprised, I have to say. And some of the footage I've seen of Israeli soldiers and snipers and that kind of stuff as well, just going, because a lot of you look like you are Arabs, you know what I mean? And I know there's Jewish Arab people, and there has been for, a very long time, but it really, I don't know, that just seeing it so starkly was quite amazing to me.
We are Semites, both
Yes.
peoples. And, it was funny because I did an ancestry test recently and I couldn't believe it. I looked at the test and up to 20% of my genes actually came directly from Palestine.
Wow. Amazing.
And I have no, direct sort of, in my direct family, mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandfathers, I know no one who was born there.
Wow. Yeah.
So, Jews, and this is part of the issue, that
Yes.
Jews have a link to this land.
Yep.
And of course, Palestinians have a link to this land. And there are 6 million, Jews there, and there are millions of Palestinians too. And there is really no solution but to work towards coexistence and a just peace for everybody.
Yes.
The problem is that extremism on both sides, and fundamentalist religion, has really derailed us.
Yep.
Has really
Indeed.
derailed in a big way.
Yeah. And, interestingly, and maybe even surprisingly or not, but the intersection of, what you might call radical Zionism as opposed to liberal Zionism, but with the formation of the kind of right-wing cabinet, but the alignment with Christian fundamentalists in the US is really kind of interesting because, evangelicals, as I understand it, are quite anti-Semitic in their kind of religious ideology, and yet they're all supportive of the kind of radical Zionist project because of the religious belief and the literalist belief of and for the Christians, the second coming. And then I'm not completely across Judaism, but the from what I've picked up, when the third temple is built, and then the coming of the Messiah, and it's just amazing that all of the Abrahamic religions intersect on this particular mount, but they did all emerge from that place, and notwithstanding all of their edicts and basic principles for peace, again, somewhere in the human brain functioning, it just ends up being justified to continue more war and conflict.
It's a very strange space that, that what you're talking about.
Yes.
But what I want to say something about the importance of diverse voices.
Yes.
Because I'm certainly not talking on behalf of anybody except myself, you know. And I think for me, I know that debate and dissent and analysis and critical analysis has been an absolutely fundamental component of Judaism over the years. I mean, you have analysts, debating the Torah and different interpretations, and this is deeply anchored into our culture.
Yes.
And I'm particularly disturbed by the situation within the Jewish community, and I'm talking about the Australian Jewish community, where there is an attempt to silence certain voices that have different opinions. And for me, this is fundamentally opposed to what Judaism is about.
Yes.
And it's also incredibly harmful and destructive within the Jewish community.
Yes.
All this talk of, you're a self-hating Jew, and which I've been accused of as well over the years. And you're not a real Jew sometimes, It's very, very destructive. And we have to stop it.
Well, and it's with the barrister hat on it. I mean, not only is it defamatory, but it's just despicable, insulting. I mean, it's kind of just grotesque to attack someone's individual dignity in that way, in order to just shut them down and intimidate them out of speaking.
Absolutely.
And I mean, we see it in so many contexts at the moment. I mean, just watching, President Trump and J.D. Vance humiliate President Zelensky at the White House, but it all comes out of abuses of power and bullying, as far as I'm concerned.
It does. And it's not, it's not good for anyone.
No.
This approach and this way of being is actually not good for anybody. It's toxic. It's not the way to peace. It's not the way to prosperity. It's
Indeed.
Not the way to happiness.
Yes.
It's not the way to harmony.
That's right.
We have to learn to listen to someone and disagree with them without humiliating them.
Totally.
And without seeking to silence them.
Yes. Which I heard there's probably another podcast I was listening to the other day, but just talking about the law being, a way to, fight with words, but also protocols and principles, procedural fairness, natural justice, etc., to maintain a basic edifice of dignity and civility in, civil discourse or whatever it is. And it should, it's obviously in all of our interest to do that. And unfortunately, when it's kind of corrupted from the top, then there is, or where the power is, then it creates a lot of
a lot of fear.
A lot of fear. Yeah.
Well,
a lot of fear, but also a lot of toxicity. I mean, when people aren't, if you go into a Jungian psychoanalysis or psychological breakdown of, reaching self-actualization, people can't do that if they are restrained from expressing themselves. And again, we return to the fundamental, universally recognized, basic human rights protections for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, etc., up until the point where it's not harming others. I just become immediately suspect when people are trying to shut down other people from expressing opinions, and certainly when it's coming from the so-called right, who are all about, so-called freedom of speech and stopping cancel culture, but then they're going out cancelling everyone. The irony is apparently lost on them. Look, it is important, and the more voices, the more grassroots ideas, ingenuities, innovations, initiatives is, all the better, again, for our society. I was listening to the ASIO director Mike Burgess this morning on another podcast, and I just think he's excellent. Like, he's really understanding in a kind of emotionally intelligent way and a socially intelligent way about what social cohesion means, and not about, I feel like Peter Dutton is all about what I call amygdalated politics. So it's all about just getting people into fright, flight, fight mode, and then just freaking out about whether it's, refugees invading our shores, or African gangs in Melbourne, or, young people on the streets, or whatever it is. It's some kind of fictional, mythical enemy that's coming to get you, to then use that as a basis. And sadly it works. Otherwise they wouldn't be trying it all the time.
I always say that some leaders lead by uniting people.
Yes.
And some leaders lead by dividing people.
Mm.
And Trump and others of his type are very, very divisive, and they get power by dividing, and that is very, very dangerous. I'll also say that one of the first things that Hitler did when he got to power, and let's remember that he got to power democratically. He was elected in. One of the first things he did is silenced his critics.
Yep.
He got rid of his critics before he did anything else. And when he came up with the hard stuff, the real stuff that he wanted to get done, the critics were actually
They were gone.
They were in jail. They were dead. They had been gotten rid of.
Yes.
So, I think it's very important not to silence people. And even the right, in the Jewish community, people that are radical Zionists that I don't agree with, but even they have a right to be heard.
Yes. Absolutely.
They have a right to be heard, and they are, and unfortunately the other side is not, it's much more difficult to be heard on the left and on the right at the moment.
Yeah. It's look, freedom of speech, the marketplace of ideas. I campaigned for 4 years to get a Human Rights Act for Queensland. We're still the only Western liberal democracy without a Bill of Rights or a Human Rights Act. And there is a campaign going, but, Australia is just an anomaly. We don't have a lot of basic protections. And then ironically, we've led the way in the development of international human rights law, from being present under Eleanor Roosevelt as one of the 8 who drafted the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, right through to a lot of other initiatives that Australia's done. But it's kind of got this bifurcated personality with regards to human rights. And I was just going to comment on what you said about leaders who divide. Absolutely, on a macro level. On a micro level, I do a lot of employment law for employers and employees, but it strikes me in workplaces, whether in the private or the public sector, you get often, not always, but personalities that are colloquially described as sociopathic, narcissists who just divide, create conflict because it feeds them in some twisted, toxic way. And I think President Trump is like the demigod archetype of that, and how everyone's just falling into line now because there's just no one to criticize him. Whether it's the mainstream media or members of his cabinet who clearly have an issue with unelected Elon Musk destroying the very government and the executive, but they're not going to speak up because, it's very sad. I wanted to say I'm very sorry, to hear about your family and their lives lost in the Holocaust, and also about what you went through with your father. And you've certainly given me a revelation because I had a violent father. So my mother had restraining orders for, 10 years on him, and a very volatile childhood. And you've absolutely turned on a light bulb in my head, because I think that's right. I have a passion for standing up to bullies, and that's often how I kind of jokingly talk about my legal practice and the other things that I do. But I think it really does come from that complete lack of power and inability to do anything or protect people you love, so that when I finally grew up and was able to become empowered, it kind of, I guess, went into overdrive to some extent. But
That's
yeah,
a really interesting realization.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, I've
incredible.
always, because of my interest in psychology, I've always gone, well, of course, there's something in my formative years that has influenced me. And then, funnily enough, the name of this podcast comes from the motto of my high school, my Catholic high school, John 23rd College, was Seek Justice. Pope John the 23rd, I should probably know more about him, but had quite. There is a theme of social justice that runs through some aspects of Catholicism, not many.
A very strong theme, I would say.
Yeah,
from my experience, Catholic networks, I think
yes,
Catholic school teaching is very, has a big place.
Indeed, yes, in the teaching. I mean, I guess I'm critical of the lack of praxis of the teaching, which I find quite frustrating. And then obviously all of the other issues with the institution and the abuses of power, which I find very, 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 very problematic. But yeah, you're right. There is a lot of, and I'm always very interested in biblical scholarship and looking at the history of, where all these stories came from and what was happening politically at the time, and all of those things. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But I've never quite. It was from you telling your story just then that I've really connected that. Yeah, I don't know. There's something about hearing you tell your story that makes me go, and you tell it with clarity, such clarity. You've obviously thought about it a lot, but it makes sense.
No, I've obviously done years of counseling.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. As we all have to do. And I mean, I have to say, I think my dad had a lot of, he had a really hard childhood, and he had a lot of psychological issues that he just didn't deal with. And so we copped it. We all copped it. So I guess that's why I'm also very passionate about mental health, and advocacy, and making people feel like there's no taboos. Go and get help. Talk to people or whatever it is. Because it is so important, and there's so many other repercussions when people don't deal with their issues.
100%. And I wanted on a slightly different. I wanted to come back to the what we were talking about with grassroots advocacy, and I'm very much a believer in grassroots advocacy. I think if you think about social change, nothing's ever changed without a grassroots movement.
Absolutely. Yep.
And it's just fundamental to change, to social change.
Yep.
And that is why, I do what I do. That's why it is my focus. It's my passion. And, people do care, whether they realize it or not. Most people do care, but it's difficult sometimes to know what to do when you see such a huge issue, like what is happening in Gaza, or like the climate change, or like, the environmental crisis that we find ourselves in. It's so difficult, to know what to do, that sometimes you just end up doing nothing, because you just don't know where to turn and what to do. And so really,
and you might not think that it is going to make a difference as well. So there's
100%,
that as well.
100%. So I think a message to your listeners, and I'm sure many of them, are already engaged in social justice, and already interested. Otherwise, they wouldn't be listening to this podcast. But, the message that I'd like to give people is how important it is to stay engaged, even if it's just something small, that you have to commit to. It is just so important to our democracy, to our children's future, to the future of our society, to the health of our society. It's fundamental. So I guess I wanted to, use the opportunity to say that as well.
I couldn't agree more. And it brings to mind I read this amazing book that I can't remember the name of, but I do remember the author, Sharon Beder. And she was from the University of Wollongong, and she wrote this phenomenal book that was about, back in the 70s in the US when Ralph Nader was doing all of his consumer protection work, which was extremely effective. And he had these congressional inquiries, calling all the CEOs before the car manufacturers, getting seatbelts and all of those kinds of things. But Sharon Beder wrote this book, which basically showed how corporate America realized that in order to influence politics and get their way, they had to engage in grassroots movements. And so what they did was they got very sophisticated, and this is just one example, but they'd have a radio shock jock, do a topic of a morning, and all these people would, ring up enraged about whatever it was. It could have been gun ownership or something like that. And then as soon as they got off the phone with the radio host, they'd be put through to a call center where their details would be logged into a database, and then they'd be put straight through to their congressperson. Now, that person would never have called their congressperson because they probably didn't know that they could, or they didn't have the contact number, or they just couldn't be bothered. But then all of a sudden, they were just directed in that way. And it's and I also remember, it makes me think there was some kind of calculus of politicians that if they received a petition that was worth so many votes. I mean, this is a bit dated, but this was back in the day when we were environmental campaigning in West Australia. If they received a pro forma letter, it was worth so many votes.
Yeah.
If they received a handwritten letter with spelling mistakes, oh my God, watch out! They'd be freaking out because that means your average Joe and Jill Bloggs were really concerned about the issue, and then obviously if people were meeting with them as well. So it's it's the Margaret Mead quote. It's never been anything more than a dedicated small group of people because, again, historically, and this goes back to what we were talking about with, people switching on or switching off, what's been happening in the last, 16, 17 months in Gaza. But it's always about 3 to 5% of a population that have really made the difference and made changes. And for good or bad, because you look at what's happening at the moment in the US, and Trump's got this minority of oligarchs who are just destroying the place.
Yeah. It's terrifying what's going on. It truly is. But we mustn't lose hope, and we have to. And hope is active. Hope is actually taking action. Hope for me is, working with the people I worked with to get the ad up. And we have to do more of this, and we have to keep doing it because there is no other choice. Maybe
Absolutely.
That's a good note.
And because it makes a difference. It makes a difference.
Yeah.
Perfect timing. And we'll have to talk about all your amazing eco adventures and eco work next time. And I'd love to talk about the Edmund Rice Centre, and there's so much to do. But thanks so much, Corinne. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to talk to you and hear all about your background and family, and very inspiring. And I even got a revelation out of it. So that's much appreciated.
Thanks, Benedict.
Wonderful.
And thank you to you
Thanks
for
so
the
much.
opportunity.
Oh, actually, sorry, just before we do go, I can't forget the poetry. Yeah, the poem at the end.
Yeah.
If you want to give us your poem.
Would you like me to read it out, or would you like to read it out?
No, I'd love you to read it out, and if you could just give a bit of background to it.
Yeah. So this poem actually came to me. Well, I got hold of it through the Edmund Rice Centre. So when I was working at the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education, and the Edmund Rice Centre did a lot of work, still does work with refugees and people seeking asylum. And this poem is anonymous, but we know that it was written by an Iranian refugee that spent quite a long time in detention when he arrived in Australia. And this was found actually on the wall. And it's an anonymous poem. So I'll read it out to you. It's not very long. I do not know what will happen after I die. I do not want to know. But I would like the potter to make a whistle from the clay of my throat. May this whistle fall into the hands of a cheeky and naughty child, and the child to blow hard on the whistle continuously, with all the suppressed and silent air of his lungs, and disrupt the sleep of those who seem dead to my cries. So this poem really touched me, and I chose it because it talks about the people who have experienced incredible suffering and whose voices are not heard.
Absolutely.
And it's very touching. It's heartbreaking, and the way it's expressed really touched me. That's why I chose it.
No, it's beautiful, beautiful. It actually made me, the way it's phrased made me think of the If I Must Die by Rifat Alaria a little bit as well. But obviously with the difference of giving the voice to the voiceless, it's profound. And the fact that it was written on the wall of one of the detention centers, but then someone obviously transcribed it from the wall, and somehow how did it come to you?
I'm not sure of the background story, but I got to know about the poem through the Edmund Rice Center, through my work at the Edmund Rice Center. Phil Glenning, the former director of the Edmund Rice Center, and Father Claude Mostovitz, who is very, active in this space, read it out, I think, at one of our meetings. And when
Beautiful.
I heard it, I just couldn't, I had to get a copy. But we don't know the background story, really. We just know that it was written anonymously by an Iranian refugee who was in detention. And that's all we know.
Wow, it's incredible. I'm going to read one, and this is a short one as well, from Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear by Mossab Abu Toha, the Palestinian, and it's called Displaced. And I guess you're talking about your experience on the trip to Israel and being on that land, and then also having your DNA, finding out that you have that connection, because there must be some, obviously in indigenous cultures, Aboriginal cultures around the world, of that connection to country, connection to the land. But you could say of all people, we all have a connection to our countries, to our land, and there's a resonance there. And it's, sorry, was that Ancestry.com? Did you do it through?
Yeah, I did. And I also want to say, in saying that, I have this, obviously, my ancestors, some of them, came from this land.
Yes.
But I also want to say that the Palestinians also have a very, very strong connection with this land.
That's right. Exactly.
So, it can be, both have a connection.
Yes.
And it has to be recognized, and a just peace means recognizing this connection on both sides, for me anyway.
Yeah. And I guess, this is for another episode, but there's a deeper questions and analysis of, yes, there might be different levels of connection, different temporal experiences of connection, different contexts of connection, whether spiritual, cultural, social, etc. But then there's also a question of how the connection is used or abused. And so, for example, I did my honours dissertation on international climate law and indigeneity. So looking at how Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures, notwithstanding colonization really tried to wipe them off the face of the earth. But in terms of the amazing ways of being, epistemologies, ontologies that they hold, that they can save us, perhaps, or certainly help us mitigate, adapt to the oncoming climate catastrophe, if only we'd listen. And, on some levels there is some listening, but there needs to be a whole lot more of it. But anyway, that's for another episode, I think.
Another podcast. Absolutely.
Yeah. That'll be for our third or fourth episode. But anyway, this poem is called Displaced, in memory of Edward Said. I am neither in nor out. I am in between. I am not part of anything. I am a shadow of something. At best, I am a thing that does not really exist. I am weightless, a speck of time in Gaza, but I will remain where I am.
Beautiful. Very simple.
Yes. Yep.
So simple. So...
Yeah, exactly. And I heard that comment the other day, I think it was might have been from a Jewish American, actually, on another podcast, but just saying that it's actually not that complex. It's always portrayed as this complexity. Yes, there are levels of complexity that it's been going on for so long, it's enmeshed, but really it's about equality. It's about dignity. With the levels of ingenuity and wealth that we have collectively as humanity on planet Earth at this point in time, I think we can solve a lot of these problems.
I think it's about seeing each other as human beings, actually.
Yes.
As human beings, whether we're Jewish, Palestinian, Christian, Muslim, we're all made of the same stuff.
Exactly. And again, that's where I come back to my, albeit superficial, but when I was just objectively looking at that video and seeing the different colors of skin, and I have to say my fiance is from Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is a melting pot of different genes and colors and whatever. And then funnily enough, we probably have the two whitest Puerto Ricans as our children because of my Irish-French ancestry. But it's, but they're Aussie Rican. They're Puerto Rican. They have that. Their mother is. And she's actually Taino, which is the indigenous Puerto Rican. But these kids are super white.
It's incredible, right?
So, but it's just, we've all got to just get over it and get on with it. And I agree with you, seeing each other as human beings. You're a wonderful human being, Corinne. Lovely to meet you, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Yeah. Okay, Benedict, all the best.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.